It always begins with a disappearance, not the dramatic kind, not flashing sirens or newspaper headlines, but the quieter sort that passes almost unnoticed. A name fades from a research paper. A voice stops returning calls. A door in a laboratory remains locked a little too long. I first came across the list late one night while researching something else entirely. A compilation of names, dates, and half-whispered reports that seem to exist only in the margins of official records. 10 scientists. 10 disappearances. Each had been on the verge of unveiling a discovery that might have altered our understanding of reality itself. And then, without warning, they were gone. It would have been easy to dismiss another online myth, another tale built on rumor. But something about it lingered. The pattern was too precise, the timing too sharp. Their stories stretched across continents. Geneva, Tokyo, Boston, Cambridge. Different fields, different obsessions, yet somehow connected by an invisible thread, as if each had reached for a boundary that wasn't meant to be crossed. I remember staring at the names on the screen, feeling that peculiar chill that comes not from fear, but from awe, the sense that we are brushing against something vast and unfinished. The thought came unbidden. What if discovery itself has limits? Not the ones imposed by physics or biology, but by something deeper, an unseen line drawn through the fabric of human curiosity. The further I read, the stranger it became. A physicist who claimed consciousness could generate matter. A geneticist who found the molecular switch for aging. A neuroscientist who decoded telepathy. A quantum engineer who opened a door between dimensions. Each case sounded impossible, and yet each one was supported by fragments of evidence that defied easy dismissal. Lab notes retrieved before they vanished. Security footage that ended too soon. Official statements that contradicted themselves. At first, I looked for patterns of suppression, the usual story of institutions protecting power. But as the trail deepened, another possibility began to take shape, quieter and far more unsettling. Maybe these discoveries didn't just threaten authority. Maybe they threatened reality itself. It's difficult to describe the atmosphere that settles over you when you start following stories like this. It's not fear exactly, more like reverence. Every scientist on that list was searching for something sacred, the truth about existence, consciousness, time, life, and death. And in every case, that search came to an abrupt stop, as though the universe itself had drawn the curtain. I think about that often, how fragile the line is between discovery and disappearance, between knowing too little and perhaps knowing too much. History remembers the scientists who changed the world. It rarely speaks of the ones who might have changed it even more, if only they had lived long enough to tell us how. This series isn't about conspiracies or hidden powers. It's about something older and more human, our hunger to understand and the strange cost that sometimes comes with it. Each of the 10 stories that follow begins the same way, with a breakthrough that challenged what we thought was possible, and an ending that left behind only questions. As I trace their journeys, from the quiet corridors of CERN to the neon-lit labs of Tokyo, I keep returning to one question that refuses to fade. When the pursuit of truth reaches the edge of what reality can bear, does reality push back? Maybe the line between discovery and disappearance isn't drawn by others at all. Maybe it's drawn by the universe, as a reminder that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. It began, as so many revolutions do, with a question that seemed naive. What if reality isn't something we observe, but something we create? Dr. Elena Rodriguez asked it quietly, almost playfully, during her early years at CERN. To her colleagues, she was brilliant, methodical, grounded in mathematics. But to those who knew her well, there was another side, an almost spiritual fascination with the nature of observation itself. She believed that the act of seeing didn't just reveal the universe, it shaped it. For 8 years, Rodriguez pursued a theory she called the observer principle. At first, it was a fringe idea, a whisper among physicists intrigued by the strangeness of quantum mechanics. The notion that observation could collapse probability into existence wasn't new, but Elena took it further. She claimed consciousness wasn't merely an interpreter of reality. It was its architect. Her research grew bolder. She gathered data that hinted at an impossible correlation, that the physical constants of the universe, the speed of light, gravitational strength, varied ever so slightly depending on who was measuring them. The differences were microscopic but consistent, as if the universe were tailoring itself to the expectations of each observer. I've seen copies of her notes, half-erased equations, fragmented comments written in hurried script. One line repeats like a mantra, "Reality requires witness." Her colleagues were divided. Some said she'd gone too far, letting philosophy contaminate physics. Others whispered that she'd stumbled onto something extraordinary. By 2019, she was preparing an experiment that would, in her words, test whether unobserved reality persists. She designed a sealed chamber, a room isolated from all human observation, even remote sensors. Inside it, she placed a quantum system to be monitored only after the fact. If her theory was right, when no consciousness was present, the particles inside would cease to exist entirely. The night before the test, she worked late in Laboratory 7. Security footage shows her entering just after 9 p.m. The next morning, the door was locked from the inside. Her keycard was never used again. When investigators finally forced entry, the lab was empty. No signs of struggle, no data, no trace of the quantum chamber. Only her jacket draped neatly over a chair and a page of notes scrawled with one final sentence. When the watcher vanishes, what remains to be seen? Officially, CERN said she had taken a leave of absence. Unofficially, her research files were purged within hours. Yet fragments survived, recovered by a colleague who refused to let them disappear. In those fragments, a chilling implication emerged, that shared belief among observers could bend the physical world. That reality itself might be a collective agreement. When I read her equations, I felt a strange dizziness, as if language itself were warping under the weight of her thought. If she was right, the world around us isn't fixed, it's negotiated. Every sunrise, every heartbeat, every law of physics is a consensus between consciousness and the cosmos. Her disappearance, then, becomes more than a mystery. It becomes an experiment without conclusion. Did she vanish into some deeper layer of her own theory? Or did the universe, unobserved by her own eyes, simply let her go? Sometimes, late at night, I imagine that locked laboratory, silent, untouched, suspended in that impossible space between presence and absence. A room that might still exist only when someone believes it does. And I wonder, what if Elena Rodriguez didn't disappear from reality? What if she disappeared with it? It started with mice that grew younger. Dr. Sarah Chen's laboratory at Harvard was small, quiet, almost domestic in its order. The hum of incubators, the sharp scent of ethanol, the sound of her careful footsteps between glass benches. To the outside world, she was another geneticist in a long line of brilliant minds. To her students, she was something rarer, a scientist who carried both precision and compassion in equal measure. Her research focused on telomeres, the fragile caps at the ends of chromosomes that fray with age, like the worn tips of a shoelace. It was a well-worn field, but Sarah had always seen something others didn't. A pattern of command, a kind of biological software hidden inside the genome. She called it the aging master switch. When she found it, everything changed. By 2020, Chen had developed a gene therapy that didn't just slow the aging process, it reversed it. The first tests were on elderly mice. Within 6 weeks, animals that had grown gray, stiff, and slow became spry again. Their organs rejuvenated, their fur regained its luster, their eyes shone with impossible vitality. The numbers said it all. The physiology of an 80-year-old body restored to 25. Her private notes, recovered later, describe what she felt the night she saw the results. "It's not immortality," she wrote. "It's remembering how to live." She spoke cautiously at first, aware of the storm such a claim would unleash. Yet she was also preparing to go public. A press conference was scheduled for September 4th. The evening before, she stayed late at the lab, making final adjustments, reviewing her encrypted data. Just after midnight, she sent a single message to a trusted colleague: "I've been warned." The next morning, her lab was sealed. Cameras showed her entering, but never leaving. University officials claimed she had resigned to pursue private research. Her research servers were scrubbed, and her notebooks vanished with her. No one saw Sarah Chen again. For years afterward, whispers circulated of private clinics in Switzerland, of anonymous trials funded by unnamed investors. Some claimed the therapy existed quietly among those who could afford it, but there was never proof. Only the enduring silence of a discovery too powerful to belong to anyone. What fascinates me most isn't the science, it's the philosophy behind it. Chen believed aging wasn't a decay, but a choice coded deep within us. A biological decision that could be rewritten. In her view, time wasn't the enemy. It was the script. Sometimes I think about what that meant for her personally. To hold in her hands a technology that could erase age and perhaps even death itself. To look at her reflection and realize that the line between the living and the eternal might be only one sequence away from deletion. Maybe that's why she hesitated. Maybe the warnings she received weren't just from others, but from within. In her last known interview, recorded weeks before she vanished, she said something that still echoes in my mind. "We want to live forever because we're afraid of what comes after, but what if the after is already within us, waiting to wake up?" I've never been sure whether that was hope or resignation. What I do know is this: if Dr. Sarah Chen's therapy still exists somewhere, hidden behind sealed doors and unmarked files, it carries with it the same question she could never answer aloud. If humanity learns to conquer time, will it still remember how to be human? He called it unlocking the signal. Dr. Marcus Webb had the sort of charisma that made skepticism difficult. Sharp-eyed, articulate, effortlessly confident. The kind of scientist who could move between neuroscience and philosophy without losing his audience. At Stanford, his research focused on the mysteries of savant syndrome, how certain individuals, after trauma or illness, could suddenly perform feats of genius they'd never studied. To most, these cases were anomalies, fascinating but freakish. Webb saw something else. He believed the brain wasn't damaged in these moments. It was rewired. His work began with brain scans of savants solving impossible problems. In every case, the data revealed a strange rhythm, patterns of neural synchronization that linked distant regions of the brain as though they were singing in unison. Normally, the human mind works in fragments, language here, memory there, emotion somewhere in between. But Webb found that under certain conditions, these divisions dissolved. The result wasn't chaos. It was transcendence. He built a device, a crown of silver nodes and fiber leads, designed to reproduce those frequencies using electromagnetic stimulation. In the lab, volunteers sat quietly as gentle pulses swept through their skulls. What happened next seemed to border on fiction. Participants began describing vivid clarity. They could recall entire pages of books they'd skimmed years before. One solved a complex equation after glancing at it once. Another wept, saying she could feel other people's thoughts like subtle vibrations in the air. Webb's data was meticulous. IQ scores tripled during sessions. Brain scans showed connections forming between hemispheres that had never communicated before. For him, it wasn't mysticism. it was neuroengineering. He called the method Consciousness Enhancement Protocol. By the fall of 2018, he was preparing to publish. The papers were drafted, the peer reviews ready, then the visitors came. First, executives from pharmaceutical firms, polite, persistent, offering to manage his technology. Then, government officials citing security interests. Webb refused them all. Days later, federal agents arrived with the warrants, seizing equipment under national security law. On November 12th, he disappeared. His apartment was untouched, his car still parked outside the lab. Within 24 hours, his data servers were wiped. When I visited Stanford years later, a technician who had assisted him recalled one session she'd witnessed. He said he could hear us thinking, she told me. Not like voices, more like light. It terrified him. Webb's work hinted at something profound, that consciousness might not be confined to the skull at all, but broadcast like radio waves across a hidden spectrum. His notes describe the brain as a receiver of the greater mind. If that's true, then telepathy isn't science fiction, it's signal strength. I sometimes wonder whether Webb's disappearance was an act of suppression or self-defense. To enhance consciousness is to remove illusion, and illusions are what keep civilizations stable. What happens to power when humanity can no longer be deceived, not by words, not by propaganda, not even by fear? He once wrote, "To hear another's thoughts is not power, it's responsibility. You can't unhear what the world is truly saying." Perhaps he learned that lesson too well. And perhaps that's why, when I imagine Marcus Webb now, I don't see a missing man. I see someone who finally tuned into a frequency the rest of us can't yet bear to hear. The first time Dr. Yuki Tanaka made an object float, she laughed. Not the triumphant laugh of a conqueror, but the startled, childlike laughter of someone who had just seen the impossible happen quietly in front of her. It was January 2021, Tokyo University. Tanaka, a theoretical physicist known for her calm precision, had spent years studying the faint relationship between electromagnetism and gravity. Her colleagues called her the one who listened to fields, a woman who treated the invisible forces of the universe like living things with moods and voices. She had been chasing a suspicion that gravity was not a fixed rule, but a negotiable agreement between mass and energy. By creating precise electromagnetic harmonics, she believed she could persuade gravity to let go. Her early experiments were erratic, instruments twitching, readings collapsing, the occasional small object lifting for a fraction of a second before falling again. Then, in late December, everything changed. Tanaka adjusted her field generator to a configuration she called Resonance Pattern 9. The effect was immediate. The object, a small metal sphere, rose into the air and stayed there, spinning weightlessly. Witnesses said she simply stood there for several seconds, staring, then whispered, "It's listening." She didn't mean the sphere. She meant gravity itself. Within weeks, her lab became a magnet for curiosity. She demonstrated localized anti-gravity zones where objects weighed less, then more, than nothing at all. Instruments confirmed the impossible, measurable changes in gravitational acceleration that defied general relativity. Her notes from that period read almost like poetry. Gravity is the memory of matter. It can be persuaded to forget. She was preparing to present her findings to the International Physics Consortium when, 3 days before, a group of visitors arrived. They weren't physicists. Security footage showed men in dark suits entering the building. Shortly after, the cameras failed. When they came back online, the laboratory was in ruins. Equipment dismantled, notes gone. Tanaka missing. Tokyo University released a brief statement saying she had accepted a position in a classified research program. No one ever confirmed where or under whose authority. Years later, one of her graduate students confided something to me. On the morning of her disappearance, he found a scrap of paper on her desk. Written in her careful handwriting were 6 words, "When we fall, What pulls us back? Her question wasn't about physics, it was about faith. Tanaka had once told a colleague that mastering gravity wasn't about breaking the laws of nature, but joining them, learning to dance with the invisible. She saw anti-gravity not as a technology, but as a conversation between matter and will. If she succeeded, even briefly, she touched a secret humanity has always sensed, but never understood, that the force which holds us down might also be the one that lets us rise. I sometimes imagine her last moments in that silent lab, the hum of machinery, the faint vibration of magnetic fields, the way her hair might have lifted in the charged air as she reached for something that no longer obeyed the pull of the earth. Perhaps she didn't vanish by force or fear. Perhaps she simply stepped out of gravity's grasp, the first human to remember what it feels like to fall upward. He had the kind of mind that never stopped listening, not just to people, but to the silences between them. At Johns Hopkins University, Dr. Robert Hayes was known for his empathy as much as his intellect. A neuroscientist by training, he studied communication, not language, but the neural dance that occurs before words take form. He believed thought itself was a signal, and that under the right conditions, one mind could learn to hear another. To most, telepathy belonged to science fiction. To Hayes, it was a matter of bandwidth. In 2019, his lab became a sanctuary of curiosity. Volunteers sat in separate, shielded rooms, no sound, no light, no shared cues. One participant viewed an image, a red apple. In the other room, the partner, hooked to identical sensors, described seeing something round and bright. It was coincidence at first, until it wasn't. Over months, the patterns grew undeniable. Brainwave frequencies began syncing between pairs, matching in rhythm and intensity even across distance. The data was clear. The brain was transmitting something more than electric noise. Hayes's breakthrough came when he developed a device that amplified those subtle neural broadcasts, weak electromagnetic signatures that carried not just emotions, but fragments of sensory experience. Using his amplification model, one subject could send an image or feeling to another. Recipients described not hearing voices, but remembering thoughts they hadn't thought themselves. When I first read his research logs, one phrase struck me deeply. We have never truly been alone, only out of range. He knew what his discovery implied, that privacy, individuality, even identity might be constructs shaped by neurological limits. If thought could travel, then separation was an illusion. But as his experiments advanced, so did the pressure. Intelligence agencies became interested, citing national security potential. Imagine an interrogation where no words are needed, a battlefield where thoughts could be intercepted like radio signals. Hayes saw it coming. In his final weeks, he told colleagues he feared his technology would be used not to connect minds, but to control them. The night before his scheduled presentation, he told a friend over dinner, "If this falls into the wrong hands, there will be no wrong hands left, only one mind everywhere." He vanished the next evening. Security cameras showed him leaving his lab at 9:12 p.m. Walking calmly, carrying a briefcase. He never arrived home. Within hours, every file related to his project was erased. Johns Hopkins called it a sabbatical. But those who worked with him remembered something stranger, a faint resonance that lingered in the lab, as if the equipment were still whispering after the power was cut. One of his students swore she heard his voice weeks later, not in a dream, but while standing in that empty room. Just 3 words. Still listening. Always. Maybe it was imagination. Or maybe, as Hayes suggested, consciousness is not confined to neurons, but woven through the electromagnetic hum of the universe. His work leaves us with an unsettling grace, the idea that every thought we've ever had might still be echoing somewhere, waiting for another mind tuned to the same frequency to receive it. And if that's true, perhaps Robert Hayes never really disappeared. Perhaps he simply stopped speaking aloud and joined the quiet conversation that's been happening between minds since the beginning of time. She once said that time was not a river, but a conversation, and that we'd only ever been listening to one side of it. Dr. Lisa Morrison worked in the hushed corridors of MIT, surrounded by quantum simulators and chalkboards filled with equations that looked like constellations. She had a way of speaking about physics that made even the most abstract ideas sound intimate. When she spoke of the flow of causality, it felt less like a lecture and more like poetry. Her research began with quantum eraser experiments, those strange demonstrations where measuring a particle in the present seemed to alter its past. Most physicists treated it as a quirk of probability. Morrison treated it as a door. She proposed that if information could travel backward through time at the quantum level, perhaps consciousness, itself a quantum process, could do the same. Not physical bodies, but awareness. She called it temporal resonance, a way for the mind to reach into its own history and whisper to itself. At first, her peers laughed. Then they saw the data. Her early tests involved random number generators sealed in isolated systems. She would focus on a pattern, say 7, long after the experiment had supposedly ended. When they checked the recorded data, sequences aligned retroactively, as if her intention had rippled backward, editing probability after the fact. Information, she wrote in her journal, has memory. Soon, the work deepened. Her lab logs described attempts to send emotional impressions, then detailed messages back to earlier versions of herself. One entry chilled me when I read it. Message received. Confirmed identical handwriting. By mid-2020, Morrison claimed she had communicated with a future version of herself, one who warned her to stop. In that message, she was told that temporal manipulation would not be used to heal history, but to rewrite it for power. Governments will weaponize memory, she wrote. They will manufacture the past. Weeks later, she arranged a private demonstration for military officials. She never arrived. Her lab was found emptied overnight, equipment gone, notebooks missing. The university stated she had joined a classified defense initiative. The truth, as always, was silence. I sometimes wonder what it must have felt like, to stand on the edge of time and realize it could listen, to look at one's own reflection and know that it might be a message sent backward, a ripple of future regret. There's something deeply human in her work. We've always wanted to undo, to send warnings, to rewrite mistakes. Morrison's theory offered not just time travel, but forgiveness made physical. But perhaps that's why she vanished. Maybe she succeeded and sent herself away. One of her colleagues later found a note tucked behind a circuit board, written in her precise hand. "Do not look for me. You already have." That sentence has haunted me ever since. If time truly folds the way she imagined, then maybe she never disappeared at all. Maybe she's always been here, scattered across the seconds, a quiet echo woven through every moment we call now. And maybe, when we dream of second chances, it's her voice we're hearing, reaching across the impossible distance between what was and what could still be. Dr. Kevin Park had a gift for finding order in chaos. While others saw strings of meaningless biological code, he saw architecture, a quiet logic pulsing beneath evolution's noise. He used to tell his students that DNA wasn't just chemistry, it was language. The oldest text ever written, he'd say, and we're still learning how to read it. At the University of California, Park became obsessed with what biologists dismissively called junk DNA, the vast regions of our genome that don't code for proteins. To most, they were genetic leftovers, echoes of ancient mutations. To Park, they looked suspiciously deliberate. He noticed repeating sequences that resembled syntax, patterns too structured to be random. Using a combination of AI pattern recognition and his own intuition, he began to map what he called genetic grammar, a set of rules by which these non-coding regions seemed to instruct the rest of the genome. Slowly, a radical theory emerged that this junk was not junk at all, but the source code for consciousness, intelligence, and even intuition. He began experiments to test it. By introducing subtle edits to these regions in lab-grown cells, he found changes in behavior, faster learning rates, enhanced pattern recognition. When he later moved to animal studies, the results bordered on the impossible. Mice not only learned complex mazes instantly, they began anticipating routes before the maze even changed. Park's notes from that period are as unsettling as they are beautiful. Evolution is not blind, he wrote. It remembers its own design. He had begun, in effect, to rewrite that design. His modified DNA sequences produced what he called synthetic intuition, an ability for the organism to predict outcomes with no apparent sensory input. When he moved to limited human trials, volunteers reported heightened perception, emotional clarity, and an eerie sense of knowing what would happen next. Then, the human data vanished. October 2019. Park was days away from publishing his paper when he disappeared. Security footage showed him entering his lab the night before. He was never seen leaving. Within hours, all his files and backups were deleted. University officials claimed he had joined a private biotech firm, but colleagues whispered about visits from military contractors and private investors eager to control whatever he'd created. A former assistant once showed me an excerpt from his final notebook, a fragment of code annotated in his handwriting. Consciousness, editable function. Underneath, a single line. When we learn to rewrite the writer, who will we become? I often think about that question. Park's work hinted that the limits of human potential aren't physical, but programmed, that fear, aggression, even mortality might be written constraints designed to keep us stable. If that's true, then editing DNA isn't just about enhancement. It's about changing what it means to be human. Perhaps that was what frightened him most. The idea that intelligence could be expanded indefinitely until individuality dissolved into something collective and unbounded. A species that no longer thinks in terms of I, but only we. Or maybe he saw the danger not in the science, but in those who would wield it. To alter human nature is to alter power itself. Somewhere in the recesses of every cell, Park believed, there's a memory of what we once were, and a blueprint of what we could still become. If his discovery survived him, it may be resting quietly inside us all, waiting for the day someone rediscovers the language to wake it. When I first read about Dr. Ahmed Hassan, I didn't believe it. The story sounded like science fiction, a physicist who claimed to have opened a doorway between dimensions. But the more I learned, the less it felt like fantasy, and the more it resembled something unnervingly real. At Cambridge University, Hassan was known as a quiet visionary. He studied quantum field interactions, the strange mathematical intersections where probability gives shape to space. His fascination lay in the many worlds interpretation, the idea that every decision, every quantum event, splits reality into parallel versions of itself. Most physicists treated it as elegant metaphor. Hassan treated it as an engineering problem. He called his field of study dimensional resonance. The concept was simple to describe, but nearly impossible to test. If two versions of reality vibrated at nearly identical quantum frequencies, it might be possible to create a bridge, not to travel through, but to observe across. For years, his experiments produced nothing but noise. Then, one winter evening, the instruments recorded something impossible, a repeating pattern, like an echo, that didn't match any known background radiation. It was a signal, a mirror version of his experiment running with a fractional difference in timing. He wrote in his log that night, "We are not alone in our equations." Months later, he succeeded in stabilizing what he described as a dimensional aperture, a microscopic rift that allowed a glimpse of another laboratory nearly identical to his own. Through it, he claimed to see a second version of himself, working simultaneously. Soon the phenomena escalated. He began receiving data packets, snippets of code and equations that seemed to originate from alternate versions of his own experiments. In each one, the research had advanced slightly further, as if other Ahmed Hassans across the multiverse were collaborating, sharing results across the fabric of reality. He called it the Interdimensional Consortium. The implications were staggering. If these exchanges were real, it meant knowledge could travel between worlds, that breakthroughs from alternate Earths could be imported to our own. His lab logs mentioned samples retrieved from adjacent realities, alloys with impossible strength, materials that resisted entropy, even documents describing historical timelines that diverged from ours in subtle, haunting ways. But not all the worlds he accessed were better. His final notes described dimensions where civilization had fallen, worlds consumed by nuclear fire, by plague, by silence. One entry ends abruptly. They are looking back. On December 18, 2020, security cameras at Cambridge recorded a brilliant flash inside his lab, followed by several minutes of electromagnetic interference. When the feed resumed, the laboratory was empty. His equipment was gone, the walls scorched, the data erased. The official statement said he had joined a classified research project. But the technicians who cleaned the site told another story, that the air itself had felt thin, as if reality hadn't fully settled back into place. I once asked a physicist who had worked with him what she thought had happened. She paused a long time before answering. If his aperture truly connected two worlds, she said, one of them had to close first. I sometimes imagine Hassan still out there, not gone, but misplaced, wandering in a version of this world just a fraction of a frequency away. Maybe he's looking through the glass as we are, wondering which of us disappeared first. Dr. Maria Santos never sought fame. She was a neuroscientist who preferred long silences, classical music, and the hum of laboratory instruments over conversation. At Stanford University, she led a small team studying near-death experiences, a topic that hovered uncomfortably between science and the spiritual. Most of her colleagues saw it as psychology. She saw it as physics. Her obsession began with a simple question: where does consciousness go when the brain goes dark? For years, Santos collected data from cardiac arrest patients who had been clinically dead for several minutes before resuscitation. They all described similar experiences: awareness without a body, vivid perception of events in the room while their brains were silent. Conventional science explained it as hallucination. Santos wasn't convinced. She developed a new kind of brain monitoring device, capable of measuring electromagnetic patterns too subtle for standard EEGs. In experiment after experiment, she found the same anomaly: faint, organized signals that persisted for minutes after all neural activity had ceased. It was as though the mind lingered, broadcasting from somewhere just beyond measurable life. Her notes became almost reverent. Consciousness, she wrote, does not emerge from the brain. It visits it. Then came the breakthrough and the danger. By using low-frequency electromagnetic fields, Santos discovered she could send coded signals into that post-death field and, impossibly, receive structured responses. The replies were primitive at first, like flickers of light and static. But over time, they formed coherent patterns: yes or no answers, even short phrases corresponding to the identities of deceased subjects. When she first reported these results at a closed symposium, half the audience dismissed them as error. The other half left the room in silence. As word spread, she faced a storm of attention from religious institutions, private foundations, and eventually, government representatives. Proof of consciousness surviving death was not merely a scientific revelation, it was a social earthquake. The very structure of belief, of law, of power would be altered. Her final entries, dated July 2021, reveal both awe and fear. She described conversations with what she called post-biological consciousness entities, minds that claimed to exist in a space where thought created reality directly. Some even offered information about advanced physics and technologies unimaginable to the living. Her last note read, "They say death is a boundary we drew ourselves." 2 days later, she was gone. Security footage showed her working late, alone, illuminated by the soft blue glow of her equipment. Then, nothing. The next morning, her lab was sealed under national security orders. Every file, every prototype, every recording, erased. Stanford called it a sabbatical. Her colleagues called it impossible. Sometimes I wonder what she found in that silence. If she truly reached through the veil, perhaps what reached back wasn't something we could contain. To prove that consciousness survives death is to prove that existence itself is continuous, that we never truly disappear, only change channels. I often picture her in that final moment, sitting in the stillness of her lab, surrounded by machines, listening for the echoes of lost minds. Maybe she heard her own name spoken from the other side and followed it home. And maybe, in some unmeasurable wavelength of reality, Maria Santos is still there, taking notes, still asking questions, still listening to the sound of thought itself. James Wright didn't look like a revolutionary. He wore cardigans, carried a chipped thermos of coffee, and spoke with the calm precision of someone more comfortable with equations than with people. Yet in the final years of his life, he came closer than anyone to proving that reality itself could be rewritten. At MIT, Wright straddled two disciplines most scientists kept separate: quantum mechanics and computer science. His fascination began with a strange observation that the behavior of subatomic particles resembled the logic of computation. Quantum systems didn't simply exist, they processed. Possibilities resolved into facts the way a processor collapses code into output. He started to wonder, if the universe behaves like a computer, could it be programmed? He called his idea reality source theory. Using quantum computing models, he built small environments where he could adjust the values of fundamental constants, the speed of light, Planck's constant gravitational strength, and then observe the consequences within the simulated field. To his astonishment, local experiments in his lab began to show faint but measurable changes, as though the surrounding physics were echoing the code. At first, he assumed it was coincidence, sensor drift, environmental interference. But the results repeated. He was altering the simulation, and the simulation was altering back. His notebooks read like both a confession and a revelation. Matter obeys because it remembers the instruction to obey. By 2022, Wright had developed what he called a quantum consciousness interface, a device allowing the human mind to interact directly with the informational substrate of reality. The process was part meditation, part programming. Operators would enter a deeply focused state, while the quantum computer translated their mental patterns into executable code. Within small, confined zones, physical constants would shift. Objects would grow lighter, magnetic fields would reverse. Even the rate of time's passage would fluctuate. He recorded one session himself. The transcript ends mid-sentence, the final words distorted by electromagnetic interference. Colleagues later described his last days as quietly frantic. He had arranged a demonstration for Pentagon observers. Hours before the presentation, he told a friend he was reconsidering. "If we can edit reality," he said, "then who decides what's real?" That night, security footage captured flickering light from his lab. Not a fire, but a distortion, like heat waves rippling through air. Then the feed went dark. When power was restored, the room was spotless. No debris, no papers, no Wright. Even the quantum interface itself was gone. MIT officials claimed he had transferred to a classified research division. But one technician who'd helped maintain his servers told me something different. The log stopped exactly at the moment the room glitched. Not before, not after. It's as if the system overwrote him. To think of reality as code is to think of existence as editable. And to someone like Wright, that might have been irresistible. Perhaps he didn't vanish. Perhaps he compiled himself. I find that idea both terrifying and strangely hopeful. If the universe is indeed an operating system, then we are all, in some quiet way, its programmers, shaping the world with every observation, every thought, every choice. Maybe James Wright just learned the syntax first. And maybe the line between scientist and creator is thinner than we ever imagined. By now, the pattern feels unmistakable. 10 lives, 10 vanishing points, each one reaching for a truth that shimmered just beyond comprehension. Yet beneath the mystery of their disappearances lies something deeper, something almost tender, the quiet rhythm that drives every act of discovery. We often imagine science as a march of progress, linear, logical, inevitable. But in truth, it moves like language does, born from metaphor and intuition before mathematics gives it structure. Every discovery begins as a story we tell ourselves about how the world might work. Dr. Rodriguez saw consciousness as the author of reality. Dr. Chen sought to reverse the script of time written into our cells. Webb tuned into the frequencies of thought. Tanaka bent the weight of existence. Hayes opened the channel between minds. Morrison, Park, Hassan, Santos, Wright, each one spoke a dialect of the same untranslatable language, curiosity. That word feels too small for what they did. Curiosity for them wasn't the act of asking questions, it was an act of faith, the belief that mystery is not the enemy of reason, but its birthplace. When I listen to their stories as a whole, I don't hear warnings or conspiracies. I hear a conversation echoing across generations of seekers who for a moment touched something immense and perhaps too intimate for us to measure. It's easy to imagine their discoveries as threats to power, but maybe the real danger was emotional, not political. If consciousness shapes reality, if death is an illusion, if we can rewrite the laws that hold us here, then what becomes of humility? What becomes of wonder if the universe is ours to command? There's a strange paradox at the heart of every great breakthrough. The closer we come to understanding, the easier it becomes to forget what drew us to wonder in the first place. Knowledge, untempered by awe, hardens into arrogance. I think of Dr. Tanaka whispering to her levitating sphere. It's listening. Of Santos, gently asking the dead if they could still hear her. Of Morrison, writing to her future self, warning her own curiosity not to go too far. These weren't the gestures of people seeking power. They were the gestures of people seeking communion. Maybe that's the true language of discovery, not formulas or theories, but reverence. A scientist staring into a microscope or a poet staring at the stars are, for a heartbeat, speaking the same tongue. They are both asking the world to reveal itself and promising silently to be kind with what they find. When I began tracing these disappearances, I thought I was following the story of suppression, brilliant minds silenced by forces afraid of change. But the longer I've listened, the more I suspect something else, that some of these truths were not taken from us. They simply withdrew, the way light retreats at dawn, not because it is lost, but because we are not yet ready to see. Perhaps knowledge has its own form of mercy. Perhaps certain discoveries wait for the moment humanity learns how to hold them without breaking. And perhaps that is what these 10 scientists understood in their final moments, that the universe speaks in a language we are still learning to pronounce, one syllable of wonder at a time. When I look back across the fragments of their lives, the labs, the notes, the unanswered questions, it feels less like a list of vanishings and more like a single echo repeating in different frequencies. 10 scientists, separated by distance and discipline, each reaching the same invisible horizon, the place where knowledge meets mystery, and neither can move forward without the other. At first, I thought I was tracing coincidence, but patterns have a way of whispering their meaning to those who listen long enough. Each of these researchers touched a truth that redefined what it means to be human. Consciousness as creator, time as dialogue, death as continuation. Their work wasn't connected by conspiracy, but by resonance, as if each discovery struck a chord that set the others vibrating across the world. It's strange, isn't it, how we think of knowledge as accumulation, adding bricks to the temple of understanding. But what if every breakthrough is also an act of subtraction? What if, to glimpse the deeper structure of reality, we must let go of the comfortable illusions that keep us safe? That's the common thread I see now. Each of them reached a point where knowledge no longer comforted, it unmade. To realize that reality can be edited, that life can be reversed, that thought transcends the brain, these are not discoveries one celebrates. They are revelations one must survive. Perhaps that's why their stories end in silence. Perhaps disappearance is not suppression, but transformation, the mind folding inward to protect itself from truths too vast to articulate. Still, I can't shake the feeling that some part of them remains, not in files or memory, but in the very fabric of the world they studied. Maybe the gravity beneath our feet hums a fraction lighter because of Tanaka. Maybe the thoughts that brush against our own in quiet moments are the echoes of Hayes. Maybe a child who will never age has Chen's genes in her bloodline. Or maybe they are simply gone, their work reduced to whispers on academic forums and forgotten archives. Yet, I wonder, when humanity dreams, who whispers back? Sometimes, late at night, I replay the last lines left by each of them. Rodriguez's cryptic, "What remains to be seen?" Morrison's, "Do not look for me. You already have." Wright's question, "Who decides what's real?" Together, they form something like a dialogue across time, a conversation about the limits of our own perception. If these 10 people truly vanished beyond our understanding, perhaps that's the final experiment, one conducted on all of us. What happens when mystery refuses to resolve into certainty? How do we respond when science begins to sound like prayer? Maybe that's the echo they left behind, the reminder that knowledge is not ownership and that every answer opens 1,000 new doors into the dark. We will keep searching, of course. We always do. It's what defines us, the species that can't stop asking why. But sometimes, when I think of them, I no longer picture laboratories or equations. I picture a circle of quiet figures standing in a place where time, matter, and thought converge, not lost, but listening for us. Every story leaves a trace, a faint residue of what once was. For some, it's a paper trail, a citation, a patent. For others, like the 10 who slipped beyond our reach, it's something less tangible, a tremor in the collective imagination. You can almost feel it, like the afterglow of a star that has already burned out. When I began this search, I thought I was chasing answers, evidence, explanations, closure. But somewhere along the way, I realized that the mystery was not the vanishing. It was the yearning that led them to vanish. Every one of these scientists began with a simple human impulse, the desire to understand, to see beneath the surface, to hear the hidden note in the music of the universe. And maybe that impulse itself is the light they followed, the same quiet radiance that guides all discovery, from the first spark of fire to the farthest reach of space. I imagine them now not as lost figures, but as explorers who stepped too far into the light of their own questions. They became reflections of the very truths they sought. Rodriguez dissolving into the consciousness she studied. Chen crossing the boundary of age until time no longer recognized her. Webb listening to thoughts too wide for one mind to contain. Tanaka ascending through the field she had learned to persuade, Hayes dissolving into the collective signal of memory. Morrison living between seconds. Park rewriting the human code. Hassan stepping into another Earth. Santos merging with the consciousness she proved survives death, right folding himself into the syntax of the universe. 10 stories, or perhaps one, told in 10 different languages. In the end, they remind me that science and spirituality are not opposites. They are twin expressions of awe, the attempt to reach beyond ourselves and touch something enduring. Each new discovery, no matter how technical, is also a confession of wonder. Every question is a prayer in disguise. We tend to believe that progress moves forward in a straight line. But maybe it spirals, a helix of curiosity that returns again and again to the same eternal questions. What is consciousness? What is time? Why are we here? What happens when we die? The answers evolve, but the longing stays the same. Perhaps that's why their stories feel unfinished, because they were never meant to be conclusions, but continuations, invitations to keep listening. I think of the closing image often, a quiet laboratory somewhere, dust motes drifting in the amber light, a notebook left open to a single line. No name, no date, just a question. If reality listens when we speak, what should we say? Maybe that's all they were trying to ask. Not for control, not for power, but for dialogue. To remind us that the universe is not a machine, but a companion, and that knowledge, at its best, is an act of love. As I finish this story, I find myself returning to a small truth that anchors me. Every disappearance begins as a discovery. Every ending is the beginning of a new question. The light they followed has not gone out. It's only scattered, diffused through the rest of us, waiting to be seen. And if we listen carefully, beneath the hum of our own thoughts, we might still hear them. Those 10 quiet voices echoing across time and matter, whispering the oldest truth we know. That wonder is not something we find in the universe. It is the universe, finding itself in us.